It has been more than 2 years since we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have been affected so much physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, and even spiritually. Let's be honest. The discussions of identifying problems and interventions dwell a lot in the areas of our physical and mental aspects. And unfortunately, through the years, many helping professionals like us have minimized and negated the social and spiritual aspects of our lives. Today, more and more studies show us that spirituality and religion play an integral role in person's mental health because these tackle the most significant questions in life. Question about our life purpose and meaning. We cannot deny that religion and spirituality are part of our identity as human beings. We naturally turn to God or to a higher being in times of crisis, needing something to anchor us and give us hope. A growing body of research has shown that spirituality and religion positively impact people's mental health. Even news outlets like Time, Newsweek, and US News and World Report have featured stories on the favorable effects of spirituality and religion on people's physical and mental health. According to a study done by a professor of psychology, Professor Thomas Plant, he observed that people whose spiritual well-being is nurtured are more likely to find meaning and make sense of life's greatest tragedies. It means they are more resilient. They are able to bounce back. People who are part of faith communities experience a sense of belongingness, empowering them to cope better in crisis. People find peace, purpose, forgiveness as they take part in religious practices. People who take time to foster the spiritual well-being tend to be more introspective and self-aware, enabling them to make more informed and wiser decisions. Another research of Luna Greenstein of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, USA, showed decreased suicide rates and substance use among people who cultivate their spiritual self. Let us also hear what a psychiatrist and a faculty of Duke University, Dr. Harold Quaining, he observed that people experience positive emotions more frequently than those who don't tend to their spiritual well-being, reducing the likelihood that their stress will result in emotional disorders such as depression and anxiety disorder. When we attend to our spiritual well-being, we nourish our body, mind, and spirit. And in turn, we increase our capacity to take care of others, including our family. This is why we certainly need to give attention to our own spiritual well-being. As medical doctors and health providers, our patients put their lives in our hands. They place their absolute trust in our opinions and judgment. They greatly depend on us to take care of them. So, it is crucial that we strengthen our spiritual self as well, doing it also for our patients. How are we now? After being in a state of crisis for more than 2 years, how are we spiritually? How is our spiritual well-being? Where are we now. The COVID-19 crisis is unlike anything we have experienced before. Can you think of what you have been through the past 2 years? Lockdowns, being stuck at home, cabin fever, the loneliness and isolation, the stress of having to shift to all onlines, to telehealth and to teleconsultation. What else? Losing the boundary of work and life balance, the intense fear and anxiety, not only for ourselves, but for our families as well, especially for frontliners like us. What else? The burnout experiences because of the overwhelming COVID cases, the distress and trauma we face as medical doctors and health providers, caring for our patients, and the personal losses we have experienced. Can you add more to the list that I gave you? If we are honest, we have to admit that we are not exempted from struggling with depression and anxiety. It may not be depression as in a clinical depression or anxiety as in an anxiety disorder, but I believe all of us have experienced feeling depressed and anxious at one point. How have all these affected our spiritual well-being? The good news is, for some people, the pandemic strengthened their religious faith. According to the International Journal of Social Psychiatry, finding indicated that there was a high use of religious and spiritual activities during the pandemic, and that this use was associated with better health outcomes, as evident by the higher levels of hopefulness and lower levels of fear, worrying, and sadness in the more religious and spiritual participants. Although there are few studies available about the current pandemic, Google searches about prayer being doubled for every 80,000 new cases of COVID-19. A great demand for religious and spiritual hotlines and religious community conference calls were also observed. Allow me now to go to the positive effects of this pandemic to our spiritual well-being. First, the pandemic prompted a more personal relationship with God. Despite the banning of worship gatherings and prayer meetings, some of us learned that all have access to God and can pray to Him even from their homes, that we don't need to solely rely on an ordained minister to connect to God. The pandemic showed us that praying with our family members at home is very similar to praying with fellow parishioners inside a church building. And because our movements were limited, we had more time to meditate, think, and reflect about our lives. We became more aware of ourselves and our connection with God. Another observation from the International Journal of Social Psychiatry, that social distancing is an opportunity to develop a stronger relationship with God by personal religious activities, such as reading Holy Scriptures and listening to or watching inspiring radio, podcasts, or TV programs. A study revealed that at least 1/3 of the participants reported having increased in their personal religious activities during the pandemic. What else? Second, the pandemic paved way for more people to access church. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, not a lot of churches stream their worship services online. But because of the pandemic, most, if not all, churches adapted, and as a result, were able to reach a new people to listen to their worship service regularly. Scott McConnell, executive director of Lifeway Research, said, "It's not surprising to see churchgoers using online options to view a church service, but there are also those who have not been church attendees who have at least checked out a church service during the pandemic. There's some of us who became more involved in religious practices like Bible studies and prayer meetings during the pandemic because groups were meeting via Zoom, Google Meet, and other means. We can attend wherever we are." Listen to a 45-year-old mother who said, "I don't have to drive an hour to sit down and read the Bible with someone. I can do it all from home. There's no running to meetings. There's no strain on my kids. There's no strain on my husband. I'm not always rushing somewhere." Because of this, we feel more connected with our faith communities. Our spirit and our soul are filled despite the chaos around us. This provided us added support and peace in times of crisis. Third, the pandemic rekindled faith and reminded people of their need for God. In most cases, when people perceive a stressful, aversive, or traumatic event, such as this pandemic, they tend to engage in religious activities or rituals to cope. With the virus quickly spreading and death tolls rising, we were constantly reminded of our helplessness as humans, that we don't really have control. This pushes us to look to the one who is greater than us, to the one who is in control over everything. Perhaps there are some of us who have grown cold spiritually before the pandemic, but the brevity of life reminded us of what truly matters. The pandemic has helped us reconnect with God and rediscover our spirituality. Let us listen to what a 20-year-old who returned to faith during the pandemic. "Down at my foundation," she said, "faith has a strong role, one that I have kind of repressed or disregarded. And I have realized that when you are especially alone, something I have not really experienced before, it's something I would really like to be able to fall back on." I was very surprised to have that feeling just hit me. Like, wow, I would really like to be in a pew right now, in a place that is bigger and holier than I am. For these people, the pandemic boosted their faith. But for others, COVID-19 also negatively impacted their spiritual well-being. This time, let us look at some of the possible negative effects of this pandemic to our spiritual well-being. First, the pandemic led to spiritual laziness and complacency. Because of the convenience of online church services, many people neglected the importance of physically going to church amidst loose restrictions. Some of us have forgotten the importance of meeting with members of our faith community. We became so comfortable that we have unconsciously drifted and stopped tilting our spiritual soil. We have forsaken our spiritual disciplines. According to the Public Religion Research Institute in the United States of America, 1/3 or more of those who had previously attended church regularly were not bothering to watch online services. For those whose church affiliation was already tenuous, the disconnection may be permanent. The failure to be mindful of our spirituality may cause us to feel distracted and defocused, robbing us of our ability to be centered. This then will hinder us from living from our core. Secondly, the pandemic triggered doubts about God's goodness and kindness. When we experience physical suffering, we also suffer from emotional and mental anguish, including spiritual distress. Our basic belief system is shaken. Because of what we have seen around us, some of us have lost faith in a loving and merciful God. Or we may not have lost faith entirely, but we have become doubtful. And we ask, if God is good, why is He allowing this to happen? Does God really love me? Why allow me to be in pain? Is He really near? Why didn't He grant my request? None of us is exempted. I'm sure at one point we have questioned God too. Thirdly, the pandemic caused spiritual amnesia and spiritual paralysis. We've experienced immense and intense fear during this pandemic. As we know, overwhelming fear paralyzes action. It shuts down our brain, causing us to revert to our fight, flight, freeze reaction. We cannot think straight. When fear overtakes us, we tend to forget the truth we know about God, His promises, and even His track record. The problem suddenly begins to look greater than God. What is spiritual amnesia? It is a partial or total loss of memory about God's truth, promises, and His track record. And as we forget about God's truth, we start to feel as though God has become distant. Our spiritual senses become dull. We cannot feel Him anymore. What is spiritual paralysis? It is when our spiritual senses become dull. We cannot hear the voice of God. We cannot feel the presence of God. We cannot see God moving in our life. We cannot smell what's from Him and what's not from Him, what's good or what is evil. We cannot taste the goodness of God. We have a hard time being grateful. These are just some of the possible effects of the pandemic on a person's spiritual well-being. And my challenge to all of us, how about you? How has the pandemic affected your spiritual well-being? Which of these did you experience? Inadvertently, how does your spiritual well-being impact your ability to serve and care for your loved ones and your patients? Each of us have our own story. Perhaps we have experienced a mixture of positive and negative effects. If we find ourselves struggling with doubts or fighting to have faith, I encourage you to keep on and keeping on. It is okay to struggle as long as we struggle for what is good. Keep fighting the good fight. Don't give up on your spirituality. In facing our battles, we can find peace and comfort in what Jesus said. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is Jesus Christ's invitation for all of us. It is free and available today. We don't only want to be medical practitioners who are merely intellectual. We want to be competent doctors and health providers who are healthy in mind, body, and spirit. And we start by taking care of ourselves holistically. And yes, that includes our spiritual well-being. Whenever we are in our own spiritual journey, I hope and pray that we take time to nourish our spirituality, because that is part of self-care. As I close, I leave you with a quotation from Palmer Parker. Self-care is never a selfish act. It is simply good stewardship of the only gift I have, the gift I was put on earth to offer others. Anytime we can listen to true self and give the care it requires, we do it not only for ourselves, but for the many others whose lives we touch. The Lord God Almighty bless you even more.